again to this semester's open classroom. How many of you have been here for a class already this semester? Oh, wonderful. How many of you are here for the first time tonight? Wonderful. Glad to have you here. I just want to give you a preview of coming attractions for the next weeks. And then, can we have that up? And kind of fill you in on what we're going to do, because I do not think you're going to want to miss any of the future ones any more than this magnificent time we're going to have this evening. Next week, March 31st, we're going to do global music. Actually, it's all about jazz. We're going to look about jazz and how it starts in America and migrates around the world and comes home. And with us will be Bob Blumenthal, the jazz critic of the Boston Globe, as well as Ted Kurland, who manages many of the great performers in Boston and around the world. In fact, he's just coming back from Russia, where he's setting up some acts. I have just spent an hour and a half with Bob on the phone, Bob Blumenthal, and I can tell you, if his lecture is 50% as good as his phone call, you will be enamored. It is going to be just stunning. And the music he's bringing with him is going to be really quite stunning. Whether you're a jazz buff or not, this is going to be something to see. A week later will be just as good. We're doing global architecture. And with us will be Peter van der Marker, many would think probably the best photographer of architecture in the world, who the day after will be leaving for a round-the-world trip, going to the Soviet Union and China, to Hangzhou to photograph architecture there. Bob Campbell, the architectural editor of the Boston Globe. Ted Landsmark, the president of the Boston Architectural College, and chairing that session will be our own George Thrush, the dean of our School of Architecture. Again, I don't think you want to miss that, and particularly if you are going to be excited by the music that Bob Blumenthal will bring here, wait till you see the photographs of Peter van der Marker. We're then going to do global film and theater. And we'll have with us Patrick Joseph, who's the president of the Boston International Film Festival, who's going to introduce us to all the films that they're going to be showing the following week during the Boston International Film Festival. We'll have my friend Eric Stange, who is a renowned filmmaker. And also to bring in theater, we'll have Spiro Valutis, the artistic director of the Lyric Stage here in Boston. If you've never gone to the Lyric Stage, you should. I'm a member of the board of directors, and I want you to go. It should be a wonderful evening devoted to film. And the way you might think about it is, when I was a kid, which I think was maybe 2 or 3 of you are that age as well, some of my best times with my father, who traveled quite a bit, is when we went to the so-called art cinema in Detroit, where we grew up. And the art cinema, of course, gave us foreign films. And we would see a film by Fellini, or we'd see a film by Truffaut, or we'd see a Swedish film by Bergman, or we'd see a great British comedy. But it was very clear that these were foreign films. You looked at it and said, this is an Italian film. This is, a German film. This is a French film. Are we moving to a time when we get really global films? One of the more recent ones that I think of as global is Slumdog Millionaire. So we're going to take a look at film and theater, and to see how film and theater is evolving in a global economy, and how a global economy and global polity affect film and theater. And then finally, although we still, not finally, the following week, while we still haven't nailed it down completely, we hope to be looking at global, not just sports, but professional sports. And if this all works out, we will have 2 guest speakers, both of whom you know very, very well. But we're going to look at how is it that the Patriots played a game this past season in Wembley Stadium in London, that 1/3 or more of the NBA are foreign-born, along with the NHL, the National Hockey League, and there are 5 different languages spoken in the Boston Red Sox locker room. What does it mean to go global in sports? And then we're adding an additional open classroom that we're co-sponsoring with our School of Journalism. We're bringing a number of people who have been in Haiti in the rescue effort, and they're going to come back here and show us images of Haiti and tell us a little bit more about what was happening immediately after the earthquake and what is happening now. I don't think you'll want to miss any of these, so please come, bring your friends. We love having you here, and we hope you're enjoying this semester as much as I am. This evening we have a really spectacular guest, somebody I've been wanting to bring to Northeastern for many years, but I'm not going to introduce him. I'm going to allow our co-instructor, my dear friend, Bill, do that to you. Bill, do that for you. Bill Dickens.
Thank you, Barry. And thank you all for coming. This is the last talk that we're going to have on global economy, and in the previous talks, during and after them, you've approached Barry or me, and many of you, and have asked, what can we do about the problems of the global economy? And if we're lucky, tonight we're going to go home with the answer, because that's what Dani Rodrik, our guest tonight, is going to be talking about. Dani is the Rafi Hariri Professor of International and Political Economy at Harvard's JFK School of Government. The list of government agencies and international agencies that Dani has advised goes on for several pages, so I won't bother reading them all to you. He is the recipient of numerous awards and is currently the editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics and the Journal of Globalization and Development, which is fitting for someone who has published so prolifically on those last two topics. I give you our speaker tonight, Dani Rodrik.
Thank you very much, Bill, for the introduction, also for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. I'm not sure I feel like thanking Barry, honestly, after what he said. Probably the worst way you could introduce a talk on economics, more and more, is by advertising all the fun things that you'll be doing in the next few weeks, global jazz, film, music, right? So if you just want to sort of go home and come back next week, I certainly understand. That's certainly what I feel like doing right now. But those of you who are still here, I thank you for your interest. This is going to be a talk on a book that I'm just finishing up on both sort of the past, present, and future of globalization. The central construct around which the book revolves is this idea of a trilemma, political trilemma of the global economy, which I'm going to be discussing here, although my publisher won't let me use the title, the word trilemma in the title, because it's supposed to be too complicated a word. So it'll be something much simpler on the title, but it is really about the trilemma. The other thing before I start, I do welcome interruptions. So if you feel like there's a comment or a question that you want to ask me, do feel free to put up your hand and ask your question or make the comment. If the question is in the nature of something that I'm going to be touching on later, or it requires a longer discussion, I might postpone it. But I don't mind if you just raise your hand and ask as I'm going along. How do I move this thing?
Arrow key.
Just the arrow keys or enter.
The volume. It's over here. Okay. Let me start with some survey data on how people around the world feel about globalization. These are you're probably familiar with surveys on globalization that periodically you read about in the newspapers or see on CNN about how upset people are about globalization in general. And most of those actually refer to surveys done in the United States. And this one has the virtue that it actually covers a large span of countries where essentially the same question was asked to respondents in a very large number of countries. The downside, however, is that it is not very recent, but I don't think that the results would look much different if you were doing this in a more recent period. basically, the respondents here were asked whether they thought that goods made in other countries should be imported and sold in the domestic market as long as people want to buy them, or they felt that there should actually be strict limits on selling imported goods to protect jobs. What you see, sort of the blue line are people essentially who feel good about trade and globalization. The red line are people who respond negatively to globalization. There's a fair amount of variation across countries, which I'm not going to try to explain. I think there is some very interesting variation. It would take a long time to sort of try to figure out why people tend to respond so differently across different countries. But I think to the extent that there is one generalization one can make about this is that in most countries, most people aren't very happy about globalization, and they don't feel very good about the role that trade is playing. To see where this is for the United States, you can see the United States is the second to last country on this chart, and roughly sort of more than 70% of the people think that there should be stricter limits on selling goods in the United States. Only about less than 30% say that there should be something like free trade or freer trade. And that's always a question of, it's a big puzzle for economists who sort of love the idea of comparative advantage and how we're all being made better off by being able to trade with other countries. And the question here is why? Why is there so much discontent with trade and globalization? Perhaps the most immediate thought that comes to mind as to why there is sort of an instinctively negative response to trade that crosses national borders, as opposed to trade that simply takes place, between Rhode Island and Massachusetts, or between two producers in this state, is that actually that international trade leads to people losing their jobs. It leads to job displacement, and I think that's sort of, you hear that complaint a lot about sort of the number of jobs that are lost to trade, to NAFTA, and things like that. But if you look at the evidence suggests that, in fact, in an economy like the United States, trade is only a minor determinant of job churning, or people losing their jobs or job displacement. That other factors, in particular, technological change, plays a much bigger role in displacing people from their jobs. And of course, technological change has been a part of the success of the history of this country's economy, and that goes along with structural change, goes with job displacement, new industries arising, older industries going down the hill, and sort of you don't have the same kind of visceral response to technological change or technological progress that you do to international trade, although from an economist perspective, they essentially are identical in the sense of being different mechanisms through which the overall size of the economic pie can be increased. In both cases, there are some winners and there are some losers, of course. But what is the difference when this happens to trade? A second kind of response that you hear is really is about inequality. That trade leads to inequality. That it enriches multinationals, it enriches people who have the right kinds of skills, highly skilled professionals, investors, and so forth. But the blue-collar workers and the less skilled are hurt by international trade, and that tends to exacerbate inequality in the United States. But once again, the evidence is that trade is a relatively small force compared to the effect that technological change has had in this country in the last few decades as a primary driver of inequality. And I would add to that that that's not true of all advanced economies, but in the United States, I don't think there's much greater tolerance in general of inequality than you get in many countries of Europe. I think it's fair to say that few people here begrudge Bill Gates or Warren Buffett their billions, and that they seem to have earned this money somehow legitimately, and one doesn't sort of necessarily react viscerally to some people getting very, very rich. What's the difference when the mechanism is international trade? The main difference, I think, that makes international trade different from domestic trade, and I think the main perspective from which we can start to have a real good handle on this attitude towards, on this generally negative attitude towards trade, I think it is to understand that the main difference is that when goods and services cross national borders, what we have is different sets of national rules, different sets of standards, different kinds of playing fields interacting with each other. And therefore, what's different is that there's a sense that when the United States imports goods and services from China, that producers in the United States might somehow be unfairly disadvantaged because they are competing with producers in China that operate under very different sets of rules. For example, they may not have to comply with the same kind of environmental safeguards, they may not have to comply with the same kind of labor rules and regulations, they may not have to comply with the same product safety standards, they may be able to bribe their government and get benefits that way. And that makes this kind of exchange very different from when you have goods made in Michigan or Rhode Island coming into Massachusetts, because, well, even though there are some differences in state rules, essentially they're all embedded under a set of national standards of what's acceptable modes of production and what the standards are and so forth. So I think that highlights the potential role that this notion that when you have the juxtaposition of different settings of rules and standards in globalization, that raises concerns about the potential fairness and unfairness of competition. This is a notion that many of my economics colleagues have a very hard time understanding and thinking about. But what I want to underscore is that I think this is fundamental in understanding why globalization is problematic in certain respects and how we actually deal with it. And as I hope I'll have time to explain, I think if you take this notion seriously, it also helps you distinguish between certain kinds of attitudes towards trade that might be less legitimate than others, in the sense that this viewing the differences in the kind of national rules that are the backdrop to international trade is that viewing concern about those differences as being legitimate doesn't exactly open up the field to indiscriminate protection. It actually helps you to discriminate between what might be legitimate complaints from what might be less legitimate complaints, because it doesn't necessarily allow for all kinds of protection that you might want to have. Now, I want to emphasize that it is not the fact that globalization entails different sets of national rules interacting with each other. The only problem that causes is not a problem of legitimacy. That there are other deeper problems, not deeper, but other equally important problems that this juxtaposition of different sets of national standards and rules entails. From an economist standpoint, perhaps the most serious would be that actually these differences in rules across different countries are in fact a source of inefficiency. And that's the kind of thing that many economists working on globalization tend to focus on. Because these differences in rules create what an economist would call transaction costs at the border. And these transaction costs are at least as important as government-imposed barriers like import tariffs or import quotas, because they make it costly for trade and investment to take place across different national settings. So let me give you a couple of examples that I'll keep returning back to. Imagine a world in which different countries, let's say the United States and the European Union, have very different rules with respect to how to regulate finance. This is a very live issue because we are now discussing the future of financial regulation. Imagine a world in which the European Union has very different rules with respect to how to regulate derivatives and hedge funds, has very different rules with respect to what credit rating agencies are supposed to do and not do, has very different rules with respect to compensation, has very different rules with respect to capital requirements that financial entities have evolved. Now, in that kind of environment, if you're a banker, if you're a financier, this is the last kind of a world this is the worst kind of a world that you want to live in, because it means that every time you're transacting, you're lending and borrowing across national borders, you have to comply with different sets of rules. And that, as Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and the European banks incessantly remind us, would make global finance, from their perspective, extremely costly, extremely inefficient. Of course, the same is true in a whole bunch of different areas. When different countries have different national currencies, they have different rules with respect to how they run their monetary policy. Well, that means that it creates currency risk, that the exchange rate might fluctuate, there might be volatile. And if you're a trader, an importer, a multinational, that currency risk is a source of transaction costs, in the sense that you enter into a contract with a foreign supplier today, you don't know actually what the domestic currency equivalent of that contract will be 6 months from now if the domestic currency fluctuates against that currency. If you are a multinational company or a bank lending to another country, but that other country has very different rules with respect to the enforcement of contracts, either formal or with respect to the actual enforcement in practice, that's a cost you have to take into account when you're lending to that entity, because you may have less certainty that you're going to get your money back when you lend to that foreign entity than when you lend to another domestic borrower. So those are all examples of instances where these differences in national regulations are actually inefficient, in the sense that they're actually segmenting the world economy. They're putting costs on trade and international investment in much the same way that explicit barriers like trade tariffs or import quotas would. So that's the second way in which these differences in national regulations are a problem for the global economy. Third is what an economist would call negative cross-border externalities. So that's the case where a country's choice of regulations and rules and standards have unwanted effects on other countries. So a couple of examples that are sort of should be obvious from recent experiences is if China has a sort of lead content standards for its toy industry that are not very well informed, that are not very well enforced, and that these toys are then exported to the United States, it's obviously consumers in the United States, young children in the United States, who are bearing the cost of these poor health safety standards, lead content standards in China. So it's a clear case of a the poor standards, the low standards in China being exported to the United States. A conceptually entirely analogous case is where the United States exports toxic, not goods, but toxic securities to the rest of the world, because if the United States financial entities issue CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, which are misleadingly certified to be safe by